I'm a diesel mechanic. For 15 years, I drifted from one broke-down farm to the next, never putting down roots because roots mean you care, and caring is where the trouble starts. When the widow outside Palmyra called about a seized-up Massey Ferguson, I figured one day's work. At dawn, I pulled in. Her twin 6-year-old girls were already on the porch watching. As I bled the injectors, one whispered, "He's staying." I hadn't said a word about staying past noon. The widow was Claire. Her husband had died 2 winters back, fighting to hold on to that land, and now the bank was circling like something that smelled blood. She stopped believing anyone would last longer than a repair job. Those twins, though, they hadn't learned that grief yet. They looked at me like I was a verdict they'd been waiting on. I told myself it was just a seized engine, a one-day favor. But the truth was already shifting under my boots, and those 6 whispered words had opened a door I'd spent 15 years locking shut. The tractor was a Massey Ferguson 135 from 1968, the kind of machine that outlasts the men who run it if you treat it right. But this one had sat dead for 2 winters, water in the oil turning to sludge, the injectors gummed up so bad the engine wouldn't even cough. The hay that should have been cut and baled in June lay flattened in the back field, a brown mat rotting into the dirt. That hay was money. Without it, this place had no breath left. I parked my truck near the sagging equipment shed and stepped out into air that smelled like sun-baked earth and something faintly sour, neglect, maybe, or grief that had seeped into the soil. The house was a 2-story white clapboard with a porch that leaned just enough to catch your eye. On those steps sat 2 little girls, identical down to the scuffed red boots on their feet and the way they clutched each other's hands. 6 years old, hair the color of dried corn silk, pulled back with mismatched rubber bands. They didn't wave. They didn't smile. They just watched me with a stillness that belonged to much older souls. I've spent my entire adult life drifting from farm to farm, repairing engines and leaving before breakfast the next morning. I don't do goodbyes. I don't give people a chance to depend on me, because the moment you let someone lean on you, you're accepting a weight that only gets heavier when you set it down. That philosophy had kept my life simple: a truck, a tool chest, a bedroll, and no addresses. I'd buried my own family losses by moving, and moving meant nothing could catch up. The twins didn't seem to know the rules. They tracked my every movement as I pulled the toolbox from the truck bed, their eyes following me the way barn cats watch a stranger. Neither of them spoke. The front door opened, and a woman stepped out, Claire. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, but tired in a way that wasn't just missing sleep. Her brown hair was twisted into a bun that had long since surrendered, strands sticking to her neck in the September heat. She held a pitcher of water with ice cubes clinking, a gesture of hospitality that clearly cost her something. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're the mechanic," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am, diesel specialist. Heard you've got a Massey that won't turn over." She nodded and set the pitcher on the porch rail. "My husband used to handle all of it. I don't know what went wrong. The hay is just lying there." Her voice caught on the word husband. I didn't ask. I've learned that widows carry the details close, and you don't pry unless they offer. I walked to the tractor. The hood was already propped open with a piece of 2x4, a sure sign someone had tried and failed. I ran my fingers over the fuel lines, checking for cracks. The injector pump was locked solid. This was going to take hours. I stripped off my gloves and got to work, the kind of methodical labor that lets your mind fall into a rhythm and ignore everything else. Except I couldn't ignore the girls. They hadn't moved from the steps. They were close enough now that I could see the slight tremor in the smaller one's lower lip, like she was holding back a question that threatened to burst out. The other one sat perfectly still, her chin propped on her fists, her gaze drilling into me as if she were trying to solve a puzzle only she could see. About 40 minutes in, I was bleeding the injectors, a delicate job that requires patience and a steady hand, when I heard it. A whisper so faint it almost blended with the rustle of the dry grass. "He's staying. I can feel it." My hand stopped mid-turn on the wrench. The voice was high and soft, the kind of sound a child makes when she's confiding a secret bigger than she understands. I didn't turn my head. I stared at the diesel pooling on the metal, and a cold prickle traveled down my spine. The second voice answered, just as quiet but freighted with a hope that seemed too heavy for a 6-year-old to carry. Mama won't have to cry at night anymore. I hadn't told anyone I'd be there past noon. I hadn't even decided it myself. I was a one-day job man, a fix-attend leave man. But those two little girls with no evidence and no reason had pronounced a verdict that contradicted everything I knew about myself. My throat tightened. I forced my hands back to work, turning the wrench with a care that was suddenly about more than the engine. The back door slammed. Claire strode across the yard, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and froze when she saw my face. I must have looked spooked, because she glanced sharply at the girls, then back at me, and the color rose in her cheeks like a fever. She shooed the twins inside without a word, her voice a low, urgent murmur that didn't carry. They disappeared through the screen door with one final look over their shoulders. The smaller one actually smiled, a tiny, knowing curve of her mouth that rattled me more than the whisper. Claire stood by the tractor, arms crossed over her chest, her face scarlet. "I'm sorry. They've been through a lot. They say things. I didn't put them up to that." I wiped my hands on a rag, buying time. "It's all right. Kids have active imaginations." She shook her head, her breath unsteady. The dish towel was twisted into a rope in her hands. "It's not imagination. They've done this before with my husband just before he died. They told him he would be all right, and he was. Now they've latched onto you, and I can't. I can't have them believing in someone who's just going to drive away." The engine of the Massey caught and rumbled to life behind us, a deep, chugging sound that vibrated through the soil. The tractor was fixed. My job was done. I should have handed her the invoice and pulled out of the yard. But the way she said drive away landed like a stone in my gut. I looked at the house, at the sagging porch, at the fields that were going to seed, and I heard those whispered words again, looping in my head. "What's really going on here?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Claire's composure cracked. She leaned against the fender of the tractor and told me everything. Her husband, Daniel, had taken out a second mortgage to buy new haying equipment 3 years ago, just before the market dipped. He'd been working double shifts at the grain elevator to cover the payments, and the stress had eaten a hole in him that no doctor could fix. One night he went to bed and didn't wake up. The bank gave her 6 months of deferrals out of sympathy, but sympathy had an expiration date. The final notice sat on her kitchen table, dated 12 days from now. $68,000 or the land was gone. The hay that was still uncut could bring in maybe a quarter of that if she hired a crew. But there was no money for a crew and no time to do it herself. She'd been trying to get the tractor running just to move the mower conditioner, but nothing worked. The neighbor to the east, a man named Harlan Grier, had already been circling, offering to take the land off her hands for a fraction of its worth, promising she could stay on as a tenant. She knew what that meant. Once the deed changed hands, he'd put her out. The twins would have nowhere to go. "I've stopped believing anyone can help," she said, staring at the ground. "Daniel used to say the same thing your little girl just whispered. He'd say he could feel it in his bones that help was coming, and then he died. Those girls have held onto his words like a promise, and now they've pinned it on you. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. You can go. I'll figure something out." She meant it. She wasn't manipulating me. She was just so tired that even hope had become a liability. I looked at the dying hay, at the bank notice in my mind, and at the window where two small silhouettes were framed against the curtain. My rule about roots echoed in my skull, but something else was echoing louder. The words of a child who had no business knowing what a grown man would choose. I didn't leave that afternoon. I stayed for supper: cold chicken, tomatoes from the garden, bread that Claire had baked that morning while she was waiting for me. The twins sat across the table, spooning beans onto their plates with the careful concentration of children who'd learned not to waste food. Their names were Leela and Cora. Leela was the one who'd whispered first, the bolder of the two, though neither spoke directly to me. Cora kept glancing at my hands, which were still stained with grease, and after a while she slid a napkin toward me without a word. Claire and I talked in low tones after the girls were in bed. I told her about my 15 years on the road, about how I'd lost my own family to a house fire when I was 22 and had never rebuilt. She told me about Daniel, how he'd sing old country songs while he worked on the tractor, the same tractor I'd just revived, and how the silence since he'd gone was the heaviest thing she'd ever carried. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she said, "but I know I can't let those girls down again. They've already lost their father. I won't let them lose their home." I offered to look at the mower conditioner the next morning. One more day, I told myself. Just enough to get the equipment running and cut some hay, then I'd leave. But the next morning turned into the next afternoon, and by evening I'd fixed 3 broken fence posts and discovered that the well pump was on its last legs. Claire tried to pay me. I refused. The twins followed me everywhere, still quiet, but now they brought me dandelions and a cool rag when they saw me sweating. By the end of the week, I'd cut half the hay and stacked it in the barn, and the bank's deadline was 8 days away. That's when Harlan Grier drove up the lane in his spotless Silverado, a man who wore a pressed shirt even on a workday. He didn't knock. He walked into the yard like he already owned it, gazed at the fresh-cut hay, and said loud enough for Claire to hear through the open window, "I see the widow found herself a hired hand. You're wasting your time, friend. That land's already spoken for." He handed me a paper, a notice that the bank had accepted his offer to buy the mortgage note. The deal would close the same day the loan came due. Unless Claire could come up with the full amount, he would own the farm free and clear. He smiled. "Nothing personal, it's just business." I watched him drive away, my hands tight on the wrench. Claire came outside, her face white, shaking. The twins stood in the doorway, Leela's jaw set, Cora's eyes brimming. And Cora whispered again, this time loud enough for all of us to hear, "He's staying. He'll stop the bad man." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was a drifter, a mechanic, a man who didn't let himself care. But I looked at Claire's tear-streaked face, at the hope in those girls' eyes that I hadn't earned, and I knew I had 8 days to do the impossible. Save a farm that wasn't mine, for a family that had no claim on me except the quiet, terrifying faith of 2 6-year-old girls who saw something I'd been hiding even from myself. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on a worn-out sofa in Claire's living room, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that spread like a map of a country I'd never wanted to visit. 8 days. Harlan Grier's clean-printed note sat on the coffee table, the bank's letterhead practically glowing in the dark. He had bought the mortgage note, not the land yet, but the legal right to call in the full $68,000 the moment that deadline tolled. I'd seen this move before, usually from men who kept their cruelty starched and tucked like a Sunday shirt. The bank got its money, Harlan got the farm at a discount, and Claire got a cardboard box and a memory. The next morning, I was under the mower conditioner before the sun cleared the tree line. The knives were dull, the gearbox leaking, but the real problem was the PTO shaft, seized up like the tractor had been. I worked with a torch and a cold chisel until my arms ached, and every time I looked up, those 2 little girls were somewhere in my line of sight. Leela and Cora had graduated from the porch. Now they stood at the edge of the hayfield, holding a tin cup of water and a biscuit wrapped in a cloth napkin. They didn't speak. They just watched, and the weight of their watching was heavier than any tool in my box. The second day, I got the mower running. The blade spun, the old Massey dragged it through the first strip of hay, and I saw Claire standing at the fence with her hand pressed over her mouth. She'd been fighting this machine since her husband died, and now it was cutting again. I wanted to feel satisfaction, but the numbers were still impossible. Even if we cut every stalk of hay on the property, baled it by hand, and sold it at a premium, we'd be $20,000 short. $20,000 might as well be $1 million when you have 8 days and no credit. Harlan showed up again on day 3, this time with a man I recognized as the county assessor. They didn't come to the yard. They stood at the property line, pointing at the fence rows, the irrigation ditch, the standing timber. I knew what they were doing, appraising assets he already believed were his. Claire was in the kitchen when I walked in, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't pour coffee. She looked at me with an expression I'd seen before on people who'd stopped fighting. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice flat. "If I sell now before the deadline, maybe I can get enough to rent a small place in town. The girls could stay in the same school. I could find work at the diner." It was a reasonable plan, and I hated it. I sat down across from her and pushed the coffee cup back into her hands. "You've got two daughters who whispered something they had no right to know," I said. "They said I'm staying. I don't know how, but I intend to make sure they weren't wrong." Claire stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "Why do you care so much? You don't know us." I couldn't give her the full answer because I didn't fully understand it myself, but something had started to crystallize, a thing I'd been avoiding for 15 years. I'd lost my own family in one single night, a fire that took my parents and my younger brother while I was away at a friend's house. I'd come home to ash and the smell of everything I loved turned to smoke. Ever since, I'd been moving because if you don't have anything, you can't lose anything. But these girls had already lost their father, and they still had the courage to believe a stranger would save them. That kind of faith was either delusion or prophecy, and I was no longer certain which one frightened me more. I stood up and went back outside, but not before Cora caught me in the hallway. She tugged my pant leg, and when I knelt down, she whispered in my ear for the first time directly, "The bad man has a secret. Papa told me." Then she pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and ran away. I opened it, a crayon drawing of a house, a tractor, and a man with a grease-stained shirt holding hands with two little girls and a woman. At the bottom, in a child's uneven letters, "Thank you for staying." That drawing went into my pocket and it stayed there. The secret she mentioned didn't surface until day 4. I was at the county record's office in Palmyra, a dusty brick building where the clerk knew my name only because my truck had been parked at the widow's farm for 4 nights. Small-town gossip moves faster than a diesel leak. The clerk, a thin woman named Mrs. Harkness, squinted at me over her glasses when I asked to see the mortgage lien and the note transfer documents. She was reluctant, but I mentioned Claire's name and something in her expression softened. "I knew Daniel," she said quietly. "He came in here once a week to make his payments on time, even when he was sick. Good man. Shame what Harlan's doing." The documents were public record, and I spread them across a long oak table. The original mortgage was straightforward, $68,000, due in full if the estate defaulted, which it had. The transfer of the note to Harlan had been executed just 5 days ago, the same day I'd first pulled into the yard. But something caught my eye. The notary stamp on the transfer was dated 2 weeks earlier. That didn't make sense. A notary confirms a signature on the date it's signed. The bank officer's signature was dated the day before the transfer was filed, but the notary had stamped it 2 full weeks before that signature existed. It looked as though the notary block had been pre-stamped and filled in later, a serious irregularity. If the notarization was fraudulent, the entire note transfer could be contested. I made copies, paid the fee, and walked out into the afternoon heat with my pulse quickening. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd seen enough property disputes to know that a flawed notarization could buy time, maybe months, maybe enough to negotiate a new payment plan or find a legitimate buyer. That was the hope that began to burn in my chest, a fragile flame I was almost afraid to name. That evening I told Claire what I'd found. We sat at the kitchen table, the girls asleep upstairs, and I laid out the copies. She leaned forward, her hair falling across her face, and her breath hitched when I pointed to the date discrepancy. "Does this mean we can stop him?" she asked, her voice so tiny I barely heard it. "It means we have a fight," I said. "A real one. I've got a friend from my Army days who's a real estate attorney in Springfield. I'll call him in the morning. If he says this is solid, we can file an emergency injunction before the deadline." Claire reached across the table and put her hand over mine. It was the first time she'd touched me deliberately, and her fingers were cold despite the heat. "I don't know how to thank you," she began, but I cut her off gently. "You can thank me when that hay is sold and your girls are running through a field that still belongs to them." The next morning, day 5, I called my friend, a man named Roy Beckett who traded his combat boots for wingtips but still talked with the blunt efficiency of a sergeant. I faxed him the documents, and he called back within 2 hours. "I've seen cleaner forgeries on a truck stop napkin," he said. "The notary is an employee of the bank that sold the note, and she pre-stamped a stack of blank forms for the loan officer to use later. That's not just irregular, It's a criminal violation of notary law. I can file a motion to void the transfer and freeze the foreclosure clock. But here's the catch. We need to prove Harlan knew about the fraud, or at least that he benefited from it knowingly. If we can't prove his involvement, the bank might just refile with a clean transfer and you're back to square one. How do we prove he knew? I asked. You find a witness, a paper trail, or something he said that ties him to the dodgy paperwork. You push hard enough and someone will crack. I hung up and stared at the wall. I had 5 days left. That afternoon, I went to the feed store, the grain elevator, the diner, anywhere people talked, and started asking quiet questions about Harlan Grier. Most folks clammed up. Harlan owned half the commercial leases in town, and nobody wanted to cross a man who could raise your rent or cancel your supply contract. But the old-timers who remembered Daniel were different. One of them, a retired dairy farmer named Ellis Crane, pulled me aside near the bulk fertilizer bin and spoke in a low rumble. "You're the mechanic staying out at Claire's place. Heard you got the old Massey running. That's good. Daniel would have liked that." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. Harlan, been after that land since before Daniel died, offered him $80,000 for it 2 years ago, but Daniel said no because he didn't want Harlan bulldozing the house his grandfather built. Not long after, Daniel's insurance claim got denied, something about a pre-existing condition the company claimed he didn't disclose. Convenient, isn't it? I always wondered if Harlan had a hand in that. He sits on the board of the insurance firm's regional branch. My spine went rigid. I asked Ellis if he'd be willing to put that in a sworn affidavit. He hesitated, then nodded. "Daniel was my friend. I'll do it." That was the first crack. A sworn statement from a credible witness alleging Harlan's conflict of interest and possible manipulation of the insurance denial was not direct proof of fraud on the note transfer, but it established a pattern. A man who would block a widow's insurance payout to force her into selling was exactly the kind of man who would fudge a notary stamp. Roy agreed. He drafted a motion and told me to gather everything I could. Day 6 started with a confrontation. I was in the barn, greasing the baler, when Harlan's Silverado rolled up and he stepped out with 2 men who looked like they'd been hired by the pound, broad, silent, with the blank expressions of men who didn't ask questions. Harlan was smiling, but his eyes were cold as pond ice. "I'm giving you one chance," he said, not bothering with a greeting. "Leave. Go back to whatever backroad you rolled in from. This farm is mine in 72 hours, and I don't need some drifter stirring up paperwork headaches. The widow will be fine. She can sell to me, take a little cash, and start over somewhere else. The girls will adjust. Kids always do." I stepped out of the barn, wiping grease onto my jeans, making sure I had a wrench still in my hand, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that I was here to work. "You're worried about the notary stamp," I said, my voice level. "A pre-stamped form." "That's a felony, Harlan. Roy Beckett filed the motion this morning. The sheriff's going to be serving you papers by noon." Harlan's smile flickered. "You think you can take me on with a technicality? I've got lawyers who will tie this up for years." "You don't have years. You've got a deadline, same as Claire. If the transfer is voided, the note goes back to the bank and they'll negotiate with her directly. You'll be left with a stack of legal bills and a reputation as a man who tried to steal from a widow and 2 little girls." Harlan stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the mint on his breath. "You're a fool," he said. "You're not her husband. You're not their father. You're a mechanic who should have driven away while you still could." He turned and walked back to his truck, but not before one of his men gave me a long, hard look that promised trouble. That trouble came after dark. I was walking the fence line, checking for gaps where cattle might wander onto the hayfield, when I saw a glow near the equipment shed. Orange light flickering against the metal siding. I ran. By the time I reached the shed, flames were licking up one corner and the gas can I'd filled that afternoon for the mower was missing. Someone had poured fuel and lit a match. I grabbed the garden hose and fought the fire alone, the water hissing into steam, my lungs burning with smoke. It took 20 minutes to kill it, and by then my hands were blistered and my throat raw. Claire came running out with a flashlight, her face a mask of terror. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," I lied, hiding my hands. "Someone tried to burn us out. This wasn't an accident." She looked at the charred shed wall and something inside her broke. She sank onto the ground, knees in the damp grass, and began to cry, not the controlled tears of a woman holding it together, but the great heaving sobs of someone who had lost too much and was about to lose more. I knelt beside her and put my arms around her, and she collapsed against my chest. We stayed like that for a long time, the smell of smoke and diesel hanging in the air. When she finally pulled back, her voice was jagged. "I can't do this anymore. The girls. I can't protect them from men like Harlan. Maybe I should just sell." I took her hands, being careful of my own burns, and looked her straight in the eyes. "Your daughters told me I'm staying. They whispered it before I'd made up my own mind. They saw something in me that I'd buried so deep I forgot it existed. I'm not letting Harlan Grier or anyone make liars out of those girls." Something shifted in her expression then. A light came back, faint but steady. Nodded and stood up, brushing dirt from her dress. "Then we fight." We filed a police report the next morning, day 7. The sheriff, a decent man named Trout, took photos of the burn site and listened to my account. He'd already heard about the notary irregularity from the courthouse. "Off the record," he said, "Harlan been a thorn in this county's side for years. I can't arrest him without proof, but I'll put a patrol on this road tonight. If anything else happens, you call me directly." That afternoon, Roy called with news that tilted the entire case. His investigator had tracked down the former loan officer who'd processed the note transfer. She left the bank 3 months ago under murky circumstances and was now living in a trailer park 2 counties over. When Roy's investigator found her, she was scared but angry, angry enough to talk. She admitted that Harlan had personally called her before the transfer and told her to use the pre-stamped notary forms because there wasn't time for proper procedure. She still had voicemails. She was willing to testify. We had him. Not just the fraud, but his direct involvement. Roy said he'd file an emergency motion to void the transfer and request a hearing before the deadline the next day. The judge was known for being fair but impatient with shenanigans. If we got the hearing, we had a real shot. That night, Claire cooked a proper meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden. The girls sat at the table, laughing for the first time since I'd arrived, and Cora leaned over to whisper in Leela's ear. Leela nodded solemnly and then looked at me. "You kept your promise," she said aloud. "You stayed." The words hit me harder than the fire had. I kept her promise. I hadn't made it out loud, but she'd heard it anyway, in that strange, intuitive way children sometimes do. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crayon drawing Cora had given me, now a little worn at the edges. I unfolded it and showed them both. "I'm keeping this," I said. "It's the best thank you I've ever received." Claire watched us from the stove, and I saw her wipe her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. The hearing was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning, the final day. We'd have one shot. If the judge voided the transfer, the note reverted to the bank, and Roy had already brokered a tentative deal with the bank's attorney to restructure the loan if that happened. If the judge ruled against us, Harlan would take the keys by sunset. I barely slept that night, and not just because of the hearing. It was the thought of leaving that kept me awake. I hadn't been this long in one place since I was a kid. I'd fixed a tractor, cut hay, fought a fire, dug up evidence, and somewhere in the middle of all that, I'd let myself feel something I'd sworn off forever. I looked at the crayon drawing on the bedside table and knew that whatever happened tomorrow, my drifting days were over. The only question was whether I'd be starting a new life on this farm or sitting in a courtroom watching Claire and those girls lose everything. And just before dawn, as the first light crept through the window, I heard a sound from the girls' room, a soft whisper, as if one twin were talking in her sleep. The words were too muffled to catch, but I didn't need to hear them. I already knew what they were saying. The morning of the hearing broke cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that makes the fields look sharp enough to cut. I dressed in a clean shirt Claire had pressed the night before. Her hands had trembled while she worked the iron, and I hadn't asked why. The girls were already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with their breakfast untouched. Cora handed me a small smooth stone she'd painted gold. "For luck," she said. Leela just nodded, her jaw set. I pocketed the stone next to the crayon drawing. We drove into Palmyra in my truck, Claire beside me in a blue dress that had belonged to her mother, the fabric faded but dignified. She stared out the window and didn't speak until we parked outside the courthouse. "If this doesn't work," she said, "promise me you won't blame yourself." I turned off the engine and looked at her. "It's going to work," I said. "And if it doesn't, I'll still be here. That's a promise I can keep." Inside, the courtroom was small and wood-paneled, smelling of floor wax and old paper. Roy Beckett was already at the plaintiff's table, a stack of files and the key document, the loan officer's sworn affidavit, centered like a weapon. Harlan sat across the aisle with his attorney, a silver-haired man who radiated the kind of confidence that came from never losing a case in a town where he owned half the judges. Except this judge was not one of them. Judge Esther Calloway was a woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense mouth and a reputation for despising sloppy paperwork. She gavelled the room to order and got straight to the point. "This is an emergency motion to void a note transfer on grounds of fraudulent notarization," she said. "I've read the motion and the exhibits. Mr. Beckett, call your witness." The former loan officer, a woman named Darlene Moody, walked to the stand like someone walking to her own reckoning. She was thin, nervous, and kept her eyes fixed on her hands. Roy led her through the details. She'd been pressured by Harlan to pre-stamp blank notary forms months before the transfer. She had voicemails of him instructing her to expedite things without proper procedure, and she had quit the bank because the guilt was eating her alive. The recorded voicemails were played, Harlan's voice, smooth and menacing, saying, "Just use the pre-stamped pages, darling. Nobody checks those dates. You're overthinking this." The courtroom went still. Harlan's attorney cross-examined, trying to paint Darlene as a disgruntled ex-employee seeking revenge, but she held her ground. "I'm risking a felony charge by admitting this," she said, her voice cracking. "I have no reason to lie except to clean my own conscience." The judge's ruling was swift. She declared the notarization invalid, the note transfer void, and the mortgage restored to the original bank pending further review. She set a preliminary injunction barring Harlan from taking any action against the property until a full hearing could be held in 3 weeks. I heard Claire exhale for what might have been the first time in days. We walked out of the courthouse into a morning that felt brighter. Roy clapped me on the shoulder. "You bought her time. The bank will negotiate now. They don't want bad press." Claire hugged me right there on the courthouse steps, her arms tight around my neck, and I felt her tears soak through my shirt. For a moment I let myself believe the fight was over, but the fight wasn't over. It was about to get much worse. Harlan emerged from the courthouse with his lawyer, and his expression wasn't defeat. It was cold, calculated fury. He walked past us without stopping, but his lawyer paused long enough to hand Roy a sealed envelope. "You'll want to read this," the man said, his tone almost bored. "It changes the landscape considerably." Roy opened the envelope on the spot. Inside was a photocopy of a promissory note, signed by Daniel, dated 2 months before his death. The note was for $32,000, made out to Harlan Grier personally, and it listed the entire farm as collateral. The signatures were witnessed by a name I didn't recognize, someone named Vernon Stroud. The note had a clause stating that in the event of Daniel's death, the debt would become immediately due against the estate. It had been notarized with a clean stamp from a different notary, one we hadn't investigated. If the note was genuine, Harlan could still claim the farm. The mortgage victory was meaningless because this personal loan would leapfrog the bank and give Harlan the right to seize the property directly. 24 hours earlier, we hadn't known this document existed. Claire stared at the photocopy, her face draining of color. "Daniel never told me about this," she whispered. "He never borrowed money from Harlan." "I believe you," I said, "which means that signature is forged." We had 3 weeks until the full hearing, but Harlan wasted no time. That very afternoon, his lawyer filed a motion to foreclose on the promissory note, and the sheriff's office served Claire with a notice that Harlan intended to take possession unless the debt plus interest, now ballooned to over $40,000, was paid within 10 days. 10 days. The judge's injunction applied only to the mortgage transfer, not to a separate personal loan. We were in a different legal box now, one we hadn't seen coming. Roy worked through the night. He sent the promissory note to a handwriting analyst in Springfield, but the analyst needed the original document, and Harlan's lawyer was stonewalling on turning it over. Without the original, the analyst could only offer a tentative opinion, which wouldn't be enough in court. We needed proof, something that would crack the forgery wide open. While Roy fought on the legal front, I went looking for Vernon Stroud, the witness whose name appeared on the note. The county records showed a Vernon Stroud living in a care facility 40 miles away, a man in his 80s with advanced dementia. I drove out there and sat with him in a sunlit room that smelled of antiseptic and old books. He couldn't remember what he'd had for breakfast, let alone signing a promissory note 3 years earlier. His daughter, a kind woman who visited every Sunday, told me that her father had been Harlan's accountant once, and that Harlan had visited him a few months ago with papers that needed his signature. Pop didn't understand what he was signing, she said, her voice bitter. I told Harlan to leave, but he came back when I wasn't here. Now you're telling me he used my father to steal someone's farm. I recorded her statement on my phone with her permission. That was one piece, but it wasn't enough to prove forgery of the note itself. I needed to show that Daniel never received the money. I called Roy and asked him to subpoena Harlan's bank records for the period around the note's date. If Harlan had never actually transferred $32,000 to Daniel, the note was a fiction. Getting those records turned into a battle of its own. Harlan's attorney fought the subpoena, claiming privacy, but Judge Calloway, who had taken a keen interest now, ordered the disclosure. The records arrived on day 5 of the 10. They showed no $32,000 withdrawal or transfer in the month before or after the note's date. In fact, Harlan's accounts showed a deposit of $32,000 from a separate source, an insurance company, around the same time. Roy's investigator connected it to a life insurance policy Harlan had taken out on an elderly landowner in the next county, a man who had died shortly afterward under ambiguous circumstances. Harlan was running a pattern: find struggling landowners, pressure them into financial traps, and cash in when they collapsed. We had enough to go to the sheriff, but we needed one final piece to break the dam entirely: the original of the forged note itself. Without it, Harlan could claim the photocopy was a mistake or a fabrication. The original had to be somewhere. Then Claire remembered something. Daniel kept a lockbox under the floorboards of the barn, hidden beneath the old hay loft. He told her about it once in passing, but she'd never thought to look. That evening, with the girls asleep under Rosa's care, a neighbor Claire had called. We pulled up the boards. The lockbox was there, rusted but intact. Inside were Daniel's military medals, his father's watch, a stack of letters from Claire, and a worn manila envelope with Harlan's name on it. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was the original promissory note, the one we'd only seen as a photocopy. And right beneath it, in Daniel's own handwriting, was a letter dated the same day. It read, "Harlan, I'm not signing this. I don't owe you anything, and I won't let you use my family's land to pay some made-up debt. Stop coming around my house." Daniel had rejected the loan. He'd never signed it. The note in Harlan's possession was a forgery, and Daniel's letter was his testimony from the grave. I handed the letter to Claire. She read it, and her knees buckled. I caught her and held her upright, the paper pressed between us. "He was trying to protect us," she choked. "He knew Harlan was trying to take the farm, and he told him no. Harlan killed him. He didn't just want the land, he destroyed Daniel." The full picture clicked into place. Harlan had tried to get Daniel to sign a fake loan. Daniel refused, and shortly afterward, Daniel's insurance claim was denied, the stress triggering a fatal heart attack. The notary fraud on the mortgage transfer was just the latest move in a 5-year campaign to ruin this family. And now we had the proof. We took the letter and the original note directly to Sheriff Trout that night. He convened an emergency meeting with Judge Calloway at her home. At 3 in the morning, she issued a second injunction, this one freezing all enforcement actions on the promissory note and ordering Harlan to surrender the original document for forensic examination. The sheriff's deputies went to Harlan's house to serve the papers, but when they arrived, Harlan was gone. His truck was missing, his safe was empty, and a neighbor reported seeing him loading suitcases and a shovel into the back. A shovel. The implication was so dark it made my stomach clench. The The sheriff put out a bulletin and the manhunt began. Meanwhile, dawn was breaking on day 6 and the farm had never felt more fragile. I went back to Claire, who was sitting on the porch with the letter in her lap. She looked up at me with eyes that had been through too much. "He's not going to stop, is he? Even with all this, he'll come back." I sat beside her and took her hand. "He's a cornered man now. Cornered men do desperate things. But we've got the law on our side, and I'm not leaving this porch until he's in handcuffs." That's when we heard the engine, not a truck, but a tractor. The old Massey Ferguson roared to life somewhere out in the darkness of the back field. I stood up, my pulse spiking. No one should have been on that machine. I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the sound, Claire right behind me. The beam cut across the rows of cut hay, illuminating a figure on the tractor seat, Harlan Grier driving the Massey straight for the barn, a gas can balanced on the fender. He was going to finish what he'd started with the equipment shed. I shouted his name. He turned, and in the flashlight's glare, his face was a mask of rage and hopelessness. He gunned the tractor forward. I ran after him, every step pounding the truth into my bones. I had to stop him, not just for the farm, but for Claire, for the girls, for Daniel, and for the man I was finally letting myself become. The tractor cleared the fence line and bore down on the barn, the flames already flickering in the can, and I knew I had exactly seconds to make a choice that would define everything that came after. I didn't think. I ran. The tractor was moving at full throttle, the gas can wobbling on the fender, and Harlan's silhouette was bent low over the wheel like a man who had already crossed every line and had nothing left to lose. The barn loomed ahead, dry timber and 100 years of family history waiting to become a pyre. I angled across the field, my boots slipping on the cut hay, and I could hear Claire behind me screaming something I couldn't make out over the roar of the engine. I reached the tractor just as the front wheel clipped the barn's corner post. The whole structure shuddered. I grabbed the fender and hauled myself onto the step, my blistered hands burning with the effort. Harlan swung an elbow at my head, wild and desperate. I ducked, got my arm around his neck and yanked him sideways off the seat. The tractor veered hard, the gas can toppled and spilled fuel across the floorboards, and the machine stalled as Harlan's foot slipped off the clutch. We both tumbled into the dirt and I rolled clear just as the tractor's exhaust sparked against the spilled gas. A blue flame rippled across the metal, but it didn't catch the barn. It died almost as fast as it had started, leaving only a scorch mark on the paint and the smell of wasted rage. Harlan tried to get up, but I was already on my feet. I stood over him, breathing hard, and I didn't hit him. I didn't need to. Behind me, Sheriff Trout's patrol car came skidding up the lane, lights whipping the darkness red and blue. He'd been listening to Claire's phone call when she dialed while I ran, and he'd been 2 minutes away since the manhunt started. Deputies swarmed the yard. They pulled Harlan to his feet, and he didn't resist. He just stared at the barn he hadn't burned and the farm he couldn't steal, and something in his face collapsed, not remorse, but the recognition that his power was gone. Claire reached me, her breath ragged, and she grabbed my hands, the blistered ones, and held them gently, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "It's over," I said. "It's really over." She nodded, but her eyes were still wide, still waiting for the next blow. I understood that. Grief teaches you that safety is temporary. It would take time for her to unlearn that lesson. The next few days were a blur of legal confirmations. The original promissory note, the one Daniel had refused to sign, was turned over to the handwriting analyst, who confirmed that the signature on Harlan's version was a clumsy trace-over. Combined with Daniel's rejection letter, Darlene Moody's testimony about the pre-stamped notary forms, Vernon Stroud's daughter's statement, and the bank records showing no money ever changed hands, the case against Harlan was overwhelming. The district attorney added charges of attempted arson, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and fraud. Harlan's lawyer quietly withdrew, and the last I heard, a public defender was negotiating a plea that would keep him behind bars for a very long time. The bank, under pressure from Judge Calloway and the damning publicity, agreed to restructure Claire's original mortgage. They wiped the late fees, lowered the interest rate, and extended the payment schedule to something a working farm could actually sustain. The hay we'd cut sold at a decent price, and the equipment shed got a new wall. The farm wasn't just saved, it was stabilized for the first time since Daniel's death. But the real change happened more slowly in the quiet spaces between the legal victories. I stayed, not because I had promised, but because leaving no longer made sense. The farm had become my home, the grease-stained barn, the rattling windows, the old maple tree by the fence, and the smell of fresh bread that now drifted from the kitchen every morning. I woke before dawn to tend the animals and fell into bed after dark with the good ache of a day's labor. For the first time in 15 years, I was planting roots, and they were taking hold. The twins bloomed. Leela started talking more, her boldness returning in fits and starts. She'd boss me around the garden, telling me which tomato stakes were crooked. Cora remained quieter, but she'd slip her hand into mine when we walked the field, and she'd still whisper things she couldn't quite say out loud. One afternoon, she tugged my sleeve and pointed to the spot where the tractor had stalled next to the barn. "Papa was there," she said. "He helped you stop the bad man." I didn't know how to answer that, so I just knelt down and hugged her. Whether it was imagination or something else, I couldn't say. But I'd learned not to dismiss the things those girls saw. Claire and I didn't rush into declarations. We'd both learned that love could be a trap as much as a shelter. But the slow, steady rhythm of shared work and shared meals and late-night conversations on the porch built something between us that needed no label. One evening, about a month after Harlan's arrest, we sat on the porch steps watching the sunset turn the wheat field copper. The girls were chasing fireflies in the yard. Claire leaned her head against my shoulder and didn't speak. After a long time, she said, "I used to think the only way to honor Daniel was to hold onto the grief, but you showed me that holding onto joy doesn't mean letting him go." I took her hand. "Daniel didn't want you to be a monument to his loss. He wanted you to live. That's why he fought so hard. That's why he told Harlan no." She smiled. A real smile, the kind that reaches back from a place pain hasn't touched. We sat there until the fireflies disappeared and the girls came tumbling up the steps, barefoot and laughing, smelling of grass and summer. Leela announced that I had to read them a bedtime story, because you live here now. Cora nodded solemnly and added, "We already knew you would." I read them a story that night, an old tale about a farmer who plants a field of sunflowers and waits for the sun. When I finished, Cora whispered in my ear, "You're the sunflower." I didn't know exactly what she meant, but it felt like a benediction. The final surprising detail came a few weeks later, when Claire received a letter from the county assessor's office. It was a notice that a mineral rights survey, ordered by Daniel years ago and buried in bureaucratic delay, had finally been completed. The survey revealed a modest natural gas deposit under the back 40 acres, not a fortune, but enough to generate a steady royalty stream that would cover the mortgage payments, and then some. Daniel had known about the possibility. He'd been waiting on the survey results when he died. The letter was dated the very day the twins first whispered that I would stay. Claire read it aloud at the kitchen table, and when she got to the date, she stopped. We looked at each other, and neither of us said a word. Some things don't need explanation. That autumn, I built a new bench under the maple tree, the one where Harlan's branch had nearly fallen, and carved 4 sets of initials into the wood: D for Daniel, C for Claire, L and C for the girls, and my own M at the end. A family etched into a tree that had survived a storm. Claire hung wind chimes from the lower branches, and when the breeze blew, the sound carried across the fields like a song Daniel used to sing. The farm was no longer a place of survival. It was a place of life. The garden produced more than ever, the hay was cut on time, and the old Massey Ferguson ran like it was grateful. I taught Leela how to check the oil, and she declared that she would be a mechanic like me when she grew up. Cora planted a row of sunflowers along the fence line, and every morning she'd stand beside them, whispering something that made them grow. I had arrived to fix an engine. I stayed to save a family. In the end, I was the one who was saved, from a lifetime of running, from the fear of loss that had walled me off from love. Those 2 little girls had whispered a truth I couldn't yet see, that staying wasn't a weakness, but the bravest thing a man could do. Their father had fought to the end for this land, and his fight had not been in vain. It had led me here, to a porch where the light was always on, to a kitchen where the bread was always warm, and to a field where sunflowers turned their faces toward the sky as if they, too, believed in the promise of a new day. Sometimes I think about that first morning, the twins on the porch steps, watching me like I was the answer to a prayer they'd been sending up every night. I didn't know it then, but those girls weren't just waiting for a mechanic. They were waiting for proof that the world could still be kind, that a stranger could become a protector, that the silence after their father's voice didn't have to last forever. I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a man who fixes engines. But I've learned that some things break in ways that wrenches can't mend. Grief breaks time, loneliness breaks hope, and loss breaks the part of you that believes you deserve to be happy. Claire had been carrying all of that, and so had I, in different ways. We were two people who'd stopped expecting the world to be fair, yet we found each other because two little girls dared to believe in something they couldn't see. The story of this farm didn't end with a courtroom victory or a mineral rights letter. It continues every morning when I wake up and hear Cora humming in the garden, when Leela hands me a wrench without being asked, when Claire sets a cup of coffee on the porch rail and lets her hand rest on my shoulder. It's in the hum of the old Massey Ferguson and the way the wheat bends in the wind. It's in the fact that I am no longer a drifter. I am home. And that's the question I carry with me now, the one I haven't fully answered. What really happened that moment the twins whispered? Was it just a child's intuition, or was there something larger at work? A thread of grace woven through tragedy, pulling a broken man toward a broken family, refusing to let either of them fall. I can't prove anything, but I can tell you that when Cora gave me that gold-painted stone for luck, I put it in my pocket next to her drawing, and whenever doubt crept in, I'd touch both and remember. I was seen before I saw myself. That kind of thing changes you. Maybe you felt it too, a moment where the path you were on suddenly turned, and you realized you were being guided by something you couldn't name. It could be the kindness of strangers, a child's unshakable faith, or the stubborn belief that a broken thing can still be made whole. The world is full of people driving away when they should be staying, leaving when they should be planting roots. But sometimes, all it takes is one person who refuses to go. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that staying is still possible. And if you want more real stories about ordinary people who stumbled into something extraordinary, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We tell the ones that don't make the news, the ones that happen on back porches and in hayfields, where hope is a quiet whisper and love shows up with grease-stained hands. Because the most powerful stories aren't about heroes. They're about the moment someone decides not to drive away.